Welcome back. I'm Shane and this is Relative Time. And today we're going to take a look at what might be one of the most underrated Swiss divers out there. And it's also a watch that has frequently come up in comments over the years. So it's also been one I've been looking at getting for quite some time. And I finally got around to buying one. So today we're going to dive into the details of the Glycine Combat Sub. Now, first off, this particular version you just can't go out and buy. It's actually a special edition that was a collaboration between Glycine and Drop.com, which used to be called Mass Drop. But more to the point, there are a ton of different combat sub options out there. Some with steel cases, some with DLC coated, and some with bronze. You also have different dial designs, and some of those have applied indices and others don't. Not to mention just a whole lot of different dial and bezel color options, as well as a few different handsets. So I think it's best to view this more as an introduction to the Combat Sub lineup. And if you like what you see, then you can always start looking at which version you like the best. Now, as I said, I've wanted a Combat Sub for a while, but I always had a hard time picking which one I wanted to get. I've always liked the coffee bezel on the Goldeneye Combat Sub, but I was never sure if I liked the black DLC case. So this particular one just happened to pop up on Drop.com. I thought it was pretty cool, and I kind of like this Explorer-like dial. It's not something you typically see on a diver. More importantly, however, is that I had a bit of credit saved up with Drop.com. And this was back in March when things were starting to get a little bit weird and a little bit worrisome. So I thought I should spend that sooner rather than later, just in case they weren't going to be around. And this seemed like a good opportunity, and that credit covered about half of the watch. Now, as far as I know, Drop is doing just fine, and I wound up getting the watch back in July. And in retrospect, if I was really worried about it, pre-ordering something months in advance probably wasn't the smartest idea. But at this point, it just sort of is what it is. Anyway, let's just dive in and take a closer look at this Coffee Combat Sub. Now, I believe the Combat Sub comes in a 42, 46, and 48mm version, but this particular one is a 42, and that is of course without the crown. Width is closer to 47. Now, lug to lug is just over 50mm, and that is a bit longer than I prefer. But the longer lugs have a nice curvature to them as they go outwards, and that does help compensate a bit, but not quite enough. With my 7-inch wrist, it still felt like it was overhanging a little. It also felt a little wide and a little flat on my wrist, but that's because it kinda is. Although overall I'd say it's pretty comfortable to wear throughout the day, and a lot of that is thanks to just how thin this thing is, sitting at 10.6mm, which would be thin for a normal watch, but simply amazing for a diver with 200 meters of water resistance. I mean, at that point, you're talking quartz territory, and this has a high-beat Swiss auto. And I think that also goes to show what the whole point of the Combat Sub is supposed to be, at least in my opinion, which is sort of a hybridization of a classic diver with a field watch, which is not only apparent from that slimmer profile and how it feels on the wrist, but in the name itself, Combat Sub. Now, this watch is very much a diver. I mean, that's apparent when you look at it. Yet the dials are all ones you would expect on a field watch, with this one being the most coveted field watch of all, the Rolex Explorer. For some, this may be an odd combination, but it's kind of an interesting one for me. Now, the case of my Combat Sub comes with a marine-grade bronze. But as I pointed out earlier, there are plenty of stainless steel and DLC-coated Combat Subs as well. The finishing on the case is quite good, but I gotta say that the overall design is a bit Spartan. It's completely brushed with no finer details or beveled edges anywhere. And I think that might disappoint some who would expect more from a Swiss diver. Yet I think when you consider the price, as well as the tool watch aesthetic that they're going for, I think that is perfectly appropriate. This isn't so much a piece that's about showing off, as it is about getting down to business. And I think that's a philosophy that's also reflected in the dial itself, and that dial sits underneath a flat sapphire with 3 layers of AR coating. Now, moving to the rear, we have a closed stainless screw-down case back, which is complete with the Combat Sub logo and all the pertinent information, including the special edition tag for this one. Back to the front, we have a bronze bezel with a coffee-colored aluminum insert. Now, that bezel sticks out just slightly, but thanks to that coin edge, it's very easy to get a hold of and rotate. You also have this small bump sitting right at the 12, and I think that is a great addition on any bezel. It sticks up and out just slightly, so it's never in the way, but adds a small amount of surface area to get a grip on, and adds a way for your hands to know where the 12 is without ever looking at it. Now, as you would expect, it's 120 click and unidirectional. The action is a little stiff when first trying to turn it, but otherwise the bezel itself is perfect. You have zero backplay and a great audible and tactile response as you rotate. Just a great example of what a bezel should be. However, I do have a little bit of an issue over at the 3. I like the shape of the no-nonsense crown guards, and the signed screw-down crown itself is a great size. It's just wide enough to be easy to use, and also looks great in proportion, yet never quite gets in the way. But the gap between that crown and the crown guards bother me a bit. I know there should be some gap, but this seems just a little bit too much. It winds up being distracting, and I think cheapens the overall look. But let's just move on. Now, this particular one is going to be hard to get, but if you really like it, it does seem to be a combination of two of the regular versions. It seems to take the coffee-colored dial and bezel of this one, and then combine that with the Explorer-like dial on this one. Now, I believe some of the Combat Subs have applied indices, but this particular one is just a thick application of paint. So it is a simpler execution than some of those, but one that I think is done quite well. And may also be a nice trade-off, just considering how thin this thing is. The dial is a flat matte dark brown, or coffee coloring, which some might also call a root beer, and that matches the bezel insert perfectly. The overall dial design is very Explorer-like, with a large triangle at the 12, Arabics at the other cardinal points, and small wedges everywhere else. And just beyond that, you do have a painted chapter ring, sort of a half train track. You even have a crown of sorts sitting underneath the 12, and that is the Glycine logo. But luckily Glycine didn't follow that up with just a whole paragraph of text above the 6. Now the hands have a brushed rose gold finish, and I think that looks great against the dark brown dial. The handset they use here is a little different. Syringe style second hand and a long thin pencil for minute, as well as whatever this thing is here. Call it a ping pong paddle, an upside down ice cream cone, or maybe a bird with a beak. Whatever you want to call it, I'm not particularly a fan of it. I appreciate the overall look and length of the hands as a whole, but that hour hand just seems a bit off to me. Perhaps it's just too roundish, and I don't think that quite matches the indices that are a bit more squarish. Or maybe it's just too similar to a Mercedes style hand. Now, maybe it's just me, but I can't help but think that this thing would look great with a snowflake style hand. But as far as I know, there's no Combat Sub with that. We also can't get much further without talking about this thing right here, and that's the date. Now, with this dial design, I think your best bet is to go dateless. But beyond that, I think you could get away with a 4 o'clock date if it's done right. But this white date wheel with red text, I can't say that's done right. At least not with this color scheme. I mean, this is just a horrible choice that stands out and really interrupts the flow of the design. At the very least, they should have used a black date wheel like they did on this one. But even beyond that, there's more of an issue, and you can see it as you look a little closer and to the bottom right of that date window. And this is something I saw even before I looked at it in macro, so it is more apparent than you might think. And that's that you can see the edge of the date wheel, and it doesn't quite fill up the entire window. Now, luckily, I think this is only on the models with the date at the 4, so the ones at the 3 should be fine. Now, as a whole, I know this is a small thing, and I'm being pretty nitpicky considering the price. But this is a Swiss-made diver, and if that's supposed to translate to a higher quality product, then that also translates into more nitpicking. So, yeah. Now, despite all of that, I really do like this dial color and layout. It's just a great use of color that offers a lot of contrast, and that enables the watch to be simple but very usable. all while that root beer coloring gives it a different look than your standard black or blue, but never seems over the top. So as a whole, I do like it. There's just a few things they could have done much better. And that does lead us to the lume. Now the lume looks great at first, and I really love how this dial lights up. But it doesn't quite have the staying power I'd like. And you can see that here as it fades out right before the Seiko turtle, and doesn't have near the oomph of either the Phoebus or the Parnis GMT. So if I were to give this one a grade, it'd be like a C+. Overall it's average and overall okay, but definitely room for improvement. Now you may have noticed that I've mentioned this has a high beat Swiss movement, but I didn't quite mention which one, and that's simply because I don't know. And that's because Glycine lists this as their own movement, which is a GL224. But it's really a rebadged ETA 2824 or Sellita SW200. Now in the past, Glycine used ETAs, but in recent years they've moved over to Sellita because they are a little cheaper. For the most part, ETA and Sellitas are equivalent, and if I had to guess, this is probably a Sellita. But the thing is, you don't really know unless you open the back up, and I'm not quite willing to do that on this brand new watch. And either way, it's a Swiss-made high-beat workhorse with hacking and hand winding, as well as a 38-hour power reserve, and this particular one was gaining only 6 seconds a day. So it's a great movement, and especially so when you consider that you can usually find these for under $400. Now, going through Glycine's catalog, there are a whole variety of bracelets and straps that you can get. And this particular one has a classic brown leather, has white stitching near the watch, and a matching bronze buckle. It's also quick release, which is something I always appreciate when I'm doing these videos. Not to mention, I think it matches the watch nicely. Now, the leather itself has a nice thick texture, but it is a bit stiff at first. So the first few days you're wearing it, it might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but after that it should break in nicely. Once it does, I think it is a pretty good strap and one worthy of keeping on the watch. After all the conversations I've had with people about the Combat Sub, I had some pretty high expectations going into this, and unfortunately reality didn't quite meet those expectations, and some of that may have to do with this particular version. So it's not quite as great as some people were making it out to be, but it's still really good, and especially so for the price. Now, looking around, you can usually find these in the low to mid 300s, which is basically Seiko Turtle and Seiko Samurai territory. And in my opinion, a lot of the components of the Combat Sub are what you would expect from a good watch at this price, such as a simple case, the strap, and the dial. But where the Combat Sub really shines is right here in having that Swiss-made moniker and having a high-beat Swiss movement at that price, which is practically unheard of. Although to be fair, at this price, Swiss assembled is probably a more appropriate term, but that still doesn't take away from having that movement. And it doesn't take anything away from just how remarkably thin this watch is, and how that translates into some added comfort. Now, if you're a fan of dive watches with a classic clean dial design, these Combat Subs aren't going to be for you. The name Combat Sub is very appropriate, as it has a field watch diver hybrid feel to it, which is why I don't think this could ever be a one watch collection type watch, but could easily be a cornerstone of a good 3 watch collection, as just a great everyday driver. And if that's something that appeals to you, they are definitely worth checking out. Anyway, that's my take on the Glycine Combat Sub, but let me know yours down below in a comment. Or if you can think of another watch with similar specs for a similar price, I'd love to know that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.